Hi East Coast Quick Co friends, my name is Sarah Wilson and I am one of the instructors at the shop. So today from home I'm going to show you how to make a face mask. So this mask pattern is by Operation We Can Sew It from Denver. I have added a few modifications which I'll show you throughout the video. It covers your nose, mouth, and chin pretty well, and it has pretty far coverage on each side of your face. So the face mask we're making has a built-in nose wire casing, and I've been using this gear tie. It's like a rubber-coated piece of wire for headphones, but it's working well in the mask and it's washable. You could also use a pipe cleaner or a paper clip, but just make sure you round the ends so that it doesn't poke through your fabric. It also has a replaceable filter pocket if you can find such a thing. And then we're going to be making fabric ties. So if you have bias tape pre-folded, you can use that. Otherwise, we'll be cutting about 1 1/4 inch strips out of fabric to make these. So this mask isn't great for fat quarters because you need to be able to cut those long strips of fabric. And since you're probably not just making one, I recommend buying at least a 1/2 meter, and you should be able to get fabric for 5 masks out of that. And then as well, you'll need fabric for the strips. I would say you need about 1 1/2 inches of fabric for each strip. It'll end up getting cut to 1 1/4, but I always like buying extra just in case something happens. So that's 3 inches of fabric per mask. So if you're making 5 masks out of a 1/2 meter of fabric, you need another 15 inches of fabric for the strips. The materials you'll need for this project are some pins or like wonder clips if you have that, some scissors, a ruler. I'm also using a friction pen to mark things, but you can use pins as well or any kind of fabric marking pencil or pen. If you have one, obviously a sewing machine and thread, but I do have friends that have been hand sewing them, so you would just need a sewing needle and thread. And then if you have one, you can use your cutting mat and rotary cutter. So from your fabric, you want to cut a bunch of ties. I'm making about 20 masks here, so that's why there's so much fabric here, but you don't need this much fabric if you're only making a couple. The rectangles, you want to cut 8 3/4 tall. So if you have a directional fabric, make sure that the pattern is going from top to bottom. So this is 8 3/4 wide, or tall. And then I always cut off the selvage first, because I tend to forget about it, and then it ends up in your project. So I'll trim that off, and then you're cutting 7 1/2 inches wide. So that's one piece done. You can do this project with 2 layers of fabric. I'm going to do 3. This is a linen cotton blend. It kind of feels like a tea towel, and I've been reading that tea towels are very effective, so that's why I went with that. But then I'm going to do 2 layers of quilting cotton, and this is a Kona solid. So I'm cutting the selvage off first. And again, this is 8 3/4 inches tall, and then we're going to cut 7 1/2 inches wide. So now I've got 2 of the lining pieces that I'm using of quilting cotton, 7 1/2 inches by 8 3/4 inch. Then I've got the outer fabric. They look like icebergs. I think they're supposed to be clouds, but in Newfoundland I like the icebergs. And then I'm going to have 2 ties. Alright, so now we're going to make the bias tape. It says to use 1 inch wide, but I've cut mine to 1 1/4 inches wide. So that's 2 pieces that are 1 1/4 inch and 36 inches long. So I make my own by ironing it, so ironing it in half down the middle, and then I finger press the other folds because I find that I burn myself pretty often when I try to do this all with an iron. This can take a while, so it's something I like to do, like watching a movie. I'll just do a bunch of tape all at once. Alright, so now we'll make the markings for our pleats, and there's a couple ways to do this. One uses the friction pen that goes away with heat, or you can make markings with a pin, and I'll do one of each so you can see the difference. The problem with the pen is that if you want to make the pleats using an iron, your marks will disappear pretty quickly. So these marks will be measured from the bottom. The first one is 2 1/4 inch from the bottom, so I'll make dashes on each side. And from there go another inch, so that's 3 1/4 inch from the bottom. And then from there another 2 inches, so 5 1/4 inch. And then finally another inch from there, so 6 2/4 inches. I'm going to also put an X here to mark the bottom, which will be important later. And so now I'll make the same marks on the other side of the other fabric. Since I'm using 2 pieces of fabric, I'm just going to make sure that they're lined up well, so that it's like one piece of fabric. And so with the pin method, it's basically the same as with the pen, but you're just going to stick a pin in instead of making a mark. And then don't forget to mark the bottom again on this other piece of fabric as well. Alright, so now we're going to crease our pleats. I like to finger press because, again, I don't have to burn myself. It's pretty easy to do without an iron. And then if you use the friction pen, your marks would go away if you use the iron. So I usually finger crease, and then sometimes I'll go over it again with an iron just to make it more crisp. So you want to fold the top crease down right sides together. So you need to know where your X is, and then go to the furthest pleat from there. The next one, so 1 inch down from there, you're going to do wrong sides together. And I like to put pins in after I've got the pleat complete, so that, I didn't mean to rhyme there, but this is just so that it doesn't get messed up later. So then the next one, after you've finished that first pleat, will be right sides together again. And then the next one, as you've probably guessed, is wrong sides together. And if you've done it really well, you'll see that the pleats shouldn't overlap at all. So the top of the next crease should just match up right next to the bottom of the other pleat. And then once again, put some pins in there. So you're going to do the same thing on the other fabric. If you don't have a right side, it doesn't really matter, but the top one again will be right sides together. And with the pins, it's kind of nice because you don't need to actually see where the mark is. You can basically just feel it. And with the 2 layers of fabric, I find it easier to pin in between each crease because the crease doesn't really stay there. And then the next ones will be right sides together, and then the one after that is wrong sides together. Alright, so now that you have your 2 face mask pieces pleated, you can press them again just to make them more crisp. But then we're going to baste stitch the edges. So a baste stitch is a long straight stitch. And sometimes I find that the pleats get a little stuck under the presser foot, so I'll stop and just lift the foot up and make sure that it's all not getting wrinkled before I move on. And then make sure you put the presser foot back down. So yeah, do the basting stitch on each side of each mask, and this will be a little bit less than a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So it'll be very close to the edge. Alright, so now we're going to stitch the two pieces together. So we'll go right sides together, and the top is what we're stitching first. So the top is where the pleat is more like a pocket. So you can go down into the pocket. And I'm going to match the pleats up first, and then from there the edges should line up. But if they don't after you've matched both pleats, if it's very different, then you can go ahead and trim the difference so that they're even, and it should be a straight line parallel with the pleats. So we're going to sew this at a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way across, and make sure you put your stitch length back to what you normally sew with. Alright, so once the top is stitched, you can make sure that the bottom is lined up. If it's not, again, make it even, but don't cut off too much because you don't want your mask to be too small. So this is where I stray a bit from the pattern. I like to do a top stitch just because it looks nice. Or I guess it's an edge stitch because it's not going all the way through. You could go all the way through, but I think it might make the nose bit a little bit itchy. So I just do a top stitch on the outside of the mask, right along the edge, about like 1/8 of an inch from the crease, from the seam. Alright, so again, this is where I stray from the pattern. So the pattern says to fold over the edge twice, but I'm just doing a zigzag stitch, and then we'll finish the seam again in the next step after this. So adjust your machine to a zigzag, and I would recommend a wide stitch that has short length. So not quite a buttonhole, but basically you're trying to keep the edge of the fabric from fraying. Alright, so once you've done that, reset your stitch to your normal straight stitch, and then you're going to pin the edges of the bottom right sides together. So we're going to sew across, but not all the way across the bottom, because you need to leave an opening for the replaceable filter that we may or may not see. But I'm leaving an opening that's about 3.5 inches wide. Alright, so now turn it right side out. And it's starting to resemble a mask, and we're going to do a top stitch on the bottom now, and I go all the way through for this one. So make it a nice crease. You can press it if you want. People who take my class know that I just love finger pressing, so I'm going to mark the opening with a pin so that I know that not to sew through that, because you still want to leave that open. And we're almost there now, but now you're just going to sew that pocket for your nose wire. So this is on the top. Make sure that it's nice and creased. And you're going to measure 1 3/4 inch from the edge of each side, and either mark it or put a pin, because this is how wide the nose wire pocket will be. And I add an extra pin in the middle just so that it's secure. You're going to sew down on the sides and then across, leaving an opening. and this is all a 1/2 inch from the edge of the seam. And I usually eyeball it, and it ends up being maybe a little bit more than a 1/2 inch, but just makes it a bit easier for me to get my rubber coated wire in there. And now that you've got that all sewn, you should be able to reach up through the filter pocket and then into the nose casing. And yeah, now it looks like a mask. Alright, so now you're going to take your bias tape strips and we're going to attach them to the rest of the mask. So I've trimmed off the little thread bits that were sticking out just so that it's even. If you do this, just make sure that you don't cut through your basting stitch because you could still lose the pleats at this point. So I fold the strip in half to find the middle point, and then I'll just eyeball it onto the mask. You could measure 16 inches from one end and match it to the top of the mask if you'd like, but it should just be centered on the mask. So the tape, no raw edges should be showing, so the tape will be wrapped around the edge of the mask. And if you have clips, this is a really great place to use them. I'll just be using pins because that's what I have. And I like to sew the strips on with a zigzag stitch. It's just easier to catch all of the layers that way. You could do a straight stitch, but make sure that you're getting all 4 layers of the bias tape as well as the mask when you're sewing through. So once you've sewn the ties on, your mask is complete. I like to tie a little knot at the end of each string, but that's personal preference. You could also maybe try using toggles so that you don't have to tie it every time. You could do a lot of different things with the ties here. If you're giving these away to people, remind them that they have to be washed each time after use. You shouldn't be adjusting your face mask while you're using it, but I'm sure you've all heard all of this already. Thanks for watching this video, and thanks for shopping local.